welcome to another episode of Lab Automation 101. Last time around, we were with the London Biofoundry in London. Today, we're coming to you from Hamburg, Germany, with Colten Wimmer from Byonoy. Colten, hello and welcome.
Hi, thank you, Alex. Thanks for having me on.
It's good to have you on. Colten, I think it would be good just for the audience, maybe if you just want to talk through a little bit your background, who you are. I know on LinkedIn it says that you're the CSO, which I believe is the Chief Sales Officer for Byonoy. So maybe just talk us through a little bit about your role, your key challenges, your headaches, things you like.
Yeah.
Maybe that would be good.
Sure. Yeah. Who knows these days what's on LinkedIn and what's in real life are not always the same thing. So, happy to give an introduction. So yeah, my name is Colten. I am the CSO of Byonoy. In terms of my background, I have a background in biochemistry, but it was pretty clear to me pretty early on that I wasn't really cut out for lab work. So I really gravitated more towards industry and always sort of had an interest in more of the business side, I guess. And I worked briefly at a pharmaceutical company in Montreal, actually, and there sort of also got to see a little bit of what it looks like from the industry side of things. And that sort of spurred me on to pursue basically more of an industry path. And I think there as well, what was important to me was still to have some type of connection to science, right? As I do have a passion for science and something I've always been interested in. So yeah, that's sort of my background. And in terms of my current position, so like you said, I'm the Chief Sales Officer at Byonoy. So that means everything to do with sort of sales, revenue generation, service, also a little bit of operations are all under my purview. And I guess the biggest challenge of my position, and I think of almost everyone's position at the company, is we're still a pretty young company. So we don't call ourselves a startup anymore, as we're trying to sort of distance ourselves from that term. But I think one of the biggest challenges is just trying to find a balance between sort of the operative tasks and the strategic tasks, right? So you're trying to develop a strategy for the company, to push the company in a certain direction, and basically a lot of that is sort of digging yourself out of this huge mess of operative assignments that just keep piling on and piling on and piling on. So I think prioritization, time management, finding the right people, those are sort of all of the struggles, I guess, that I could say that I deal with on a day-to-day basis. But it's good. It keeps you on your toes. I think that's one thing about a startup as well, or I shouldn't say startup, but it's about something about a smaller company is, when you wear many different hats, it really forces you to find the best solution to be efficient, because if you aren't efficient, you're just going to drown in whatever it is you're doing. So, we have to automate in the theme of the podcast. You do have to automate tasks, and we've used software tools to do that. We've implemented software tools to automate certain things, just so we can really get as much efficiency as we possibly can out of what it is that we're doing and the tools that we're using. So I guess that's sort of what I would say about that.
Yeah, I can relate to that as well. Not being in startup mode, sort of in between startup and established, and all the headaches that come with that, to be honest. But Colten, I have to say your accent is throwing me off a little bit. I thought, okay, we've had some other German guests on before. Coming from Hamburg, I thought, okay, it's going to be a strong, thick German accent. You've got what's way more of a Canadian accent, I think, or American accent even.
Well, okay, I was going to say Canadian is pretty good. If you can hear that, you have a good ear. But I am actually originally from Canada, so okay. Yeah. But I live and work in Hamburg, which is where we're headquartered. So Byonoy's headquarters is here in Hamburg, Germany. But yeah, the the non-German accent is a little bit difficult to hide. Yeah. But
well, how did you end up all the way in I'm assuming if you went to McGill, you're probably from Montreal. And if so, how did you end up in Hamburg then?
Yeah, actually, I'm originally from a very small town in Western Canada, but I did move to Montreal at some point, and then I went to school there. I was there for about 5 years, and as part of it's called PAD, which is like a German program. It's in the US, it's better known as Fulbright, and it's basically an international sort of exchange program. And I joined that program after I graduated university. I had taken a couple of German classes at university, and I liked it. So I thought, either, the way it is with languages, right? You can either forget everything you know about that language within a 6-month period after you stop taking classes, or you can really put some more time and effort into it and get it to a point where you'll hopefully never forget it. And that was my approach with coming to Germany. So I was supposed to be here for 8 months actually. And then I met my girlfriend. Very cliche, typical story, but then I met my girlfriend, who's now my wife, and it just got more and more difficult to leave. And then Byonoy happened as well, and turns out it's a bit of a permanent solution.
All right, well that's good. I think you're the second guest we've had who's moved to a foreign country and stayed there because they found their wife.
Yes, it's a good reason to stay anywhere, I think. So.
I think so. Yeah, it would be. And Colten, you spoke earlier about your passion for science, and I'm just curious. Then, what triggered your interest in that subject?
It's a good question. I mean, I think I always had an interest, even as a small kid, in sort of, what really is tangible, is provable. I always had sort of that mindset. I was, again, it's a bit of a cliche, but I actually did have a little lab kit when I was a kid, and I had a small microscope, and I would look at things under the microscope, and I used to, mix different things together and make potions. And I think I should have been a chemist, but I ended up actually developing a bit of an interest in sort of viruses, virology, and bacteria, which, at a younger age, those types of topics I think are just generally more appealing, right? Because I remember sort of finding out about viruses and the fact that they're, not really alive, but also not dead. They can't replicate without a host, so they can't really be considered as living organisms, but then they can replicate with a host. So it's like, what is this entity that's, somewhere in the rift between life and death? And that was sort of something that fascinated me early on. And then, more at a high school level. And then I just gravitated more towards, although I definitely had an interest in other sciences, but mostly towards STEM. So I also liked physics until I got to university. I liked physics a lot less.
I don't like it that much anymore.
Yeah, exactly. But and then once I got to university, it was after my first year, you had to sort of choose a direction you wanted to go in, and everyone said biochem was the most difficult program at McGill, so that's actually the reason I ended up choosing it. It was like, well, if it's difficult, it's got to be good, right? So the logic broke down there at some point, but like I said, I think that was what sort of drove the passion, and really finding answers to questions, and setting up a method to determine an answer, sort of the whole scientific process, is something I've always liked. So I guess that's probably where it started for me.
Oh, that's very cool. And if we were to switch now to Byonoy, and I assume I'm pronouncing that correctly, yeah?
You are actually, which is amazing, I must say, because nobody can pronounce the name of the company. It's turned into a bit of a running gag here, but we like it. It's a good way to start a conversation with someone.
Does it mean anything, by the way? Does it stand for anything, or?
It does, actually, yeah. So bio, like bio, like biology, right? And then neu is the German word for new. So it's basically like bio new would be the translation of it. And the Ys, the Ys, they look better. There's a certain aesthetic, and it's more difficult to run into trademark issues with some Ys in there. So
good point. But I guess that falls in nicely then to my next question, because your slogan, I guess, or your tagline is re-envisioning the laboratory. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, that's a very profound statement to make. We're re-envision the laboratory. I guess I could take a stab as to what it means, but I won't. Yeah, I'm going to ask you what it means exactly, and then I think more importantly, what are you guys doing to bring that to life, really? And if you can share any examples, that would be great.
Yeah, for sure. So I think I can definitely talk generally about what we understand Re-Envision Laboratory to mean, and I think that just organically there will be a few examples there that I'll
Okay.
bring up. I think this is something we have spent a lot of time thinking about, and we originally had a different slogan, but this then it wasn't like, okay, is this really what we're doing? What is it we're actually doing with our devices? It's one thing to launch a product, and we had a lot of success with our first product as well, but we did put a lot of time into thinking about the impact that we were really having, and especially some of the pain points that we in economics, they talk about the idea of revealed preference, right? Versus explicit preference. And I think that's something that we really were able to tap into with a lot of our users was, the way that they were working, they were dissatisfied with it, but they probably wouldn't have been able to really iterate or to really express why they were or what part of their workflow they were dissatisfied with. But once there was an alternative that was offered, right, then we saw the feedback we were getting from the market and just such an overwhelmingly positive response. And I think that what I'm referring to there is basically just the sort of the general workflow in the laboratory as pertains to our instruments. Of course, there are many workflows in the laboratory, but it's just if we're talking about microplate readers, which is where we've sort of made our name in the last few years. Basically, there's a lot of centralized infrastructure that has established itself over the years in sort of an academic setting, in a laboratory setting. And what we've seen, or what we had seen, is that the requirements of the user in the laboratory were just drifting farther and farther away from what it was that manufacturers were doing. So, we were getting this approach where the idea was to build as many features as humanly possible into one instrument, right? So just whatever you can get your hands on, just pack it in there, right? If we want, it's like, okay, we want luminescence, fluorescence, TR, fret, absorbance, just pack it all into this one instrument, right? And a lot of things, again, I guess that has its reason for being there, and there are certain cases where you just do need that type of flexibility. But what we had sort of observed was there were many cases where certain users, certain people in the lab were just getting left behind. And for us, it was basically the approach to say, okay, we're providing tailored instruments, right? So we manufacture single mode measurement instruments instead of like a multi-mode reader. And that just allows us to offer certain advantages. And I think one of the big ones and one of the big pain points we were able to tap into was sort of this idea of decentralization. So like I mentioned, these big devices, the larger they get, the more they really are designed to be stored at a central location. And a lot of times, if you move them, you actually have to recalibrate them, for example. So they just lend themselves well to being stored at a single spot in the laboratory. And of course, you need the budget to be able to afford these devices in the first place. So that pushes them even more towards centralization, right? So you have this setup in laboratories where you would have, for example, a core facility or a nodal lab, sometimes they're also called. And this is basically a facility within an academic institution, but also within other research institutions where there is a well-funded lab that has a lot of instrumentation, or basically all of the instrumentation. And those instruments are then shared by multiple surrounding lab groups. And as I'm sure you can imagine, this can turn out to be a bit of a bottleneck, especially when you have, let's say, you have fluorescence, luminescence, and absorbance all in the same instrument. What happens if someone wants to run a kinetics experiment for 3 days, be it luminescence or an absorbance measurement, for example, some type of, bacterial growth curve? Everyone in the surrounding area loses access to their microplate reader for that time period, right? So again, that was one part of Re-Envision Laboratory, was to say, okay, can we break this up? Can we decentralize the lab a little bit more? Can we have individual users with individual instruments, within their own laboratory space? So again, moving away from the idea of really the user taking their experiment to the reader and bringing the reader back to the user. So I mean, you can imagine this as well, right? Just imagine if every time you wanted to vortex a sample, you had to run to an adjacent laboratory, or in a lot of cases, just to give you a concrete example, the one of our customers, he was actually having to go into an adjacent building in order to access the microplate reader. And they had this elaborate booking system set up so that he could book his time slot on the day that he actually needed to use the microplate reader. And because again, his lab wasn't very big, didn't have a huge budget for this type of equipment. And he would book a time slot. Sometimes there would be someone there who hadn't, booked that time slot, but was just using the microplate reader anyways. And all of his sample prep for that day, he would basically just have to throw away because he'd either have to measure then or not at all. So again, we did an interview with him as well, and he purchased one of our devices. He was basically the only one who used it and was in his lab, sort of his own personal microplate reader. So like I said, that's definitely one aspect of Re-Envision Laboratory that's particularly important. I think is also really important amongst our users as well. I think the second point is, I've touched on this a little bit already, and these are of course all related to each other, but this is sort of more the idea of flexibility. Mm-hmm. And I've touched on it a little bit in terms of decentralization, right? So the idea that you can now have a device at your benchtop instead of wherever it may be within the building or within even in an adjacent building. But there's sort of other things that come along with building compact, simplified instruments, and those are really in some cases new application possibilities. So we've had a lot of customers who be really excited about putting our devices into anaerobic chambers or inside of incubators, and really just coming up with pretty crazy ideas. So I think that's something that's also really nice to see, and also plays into our vision of saying, okay, what else are we doing with these small, sort of compact, personalized devices aside from just pushing this trend of decentralization, but really adding different or enabling new applications. And I guess the last point, or what we understand Re-Envision Laboratories to be, is maybe, I guess, a combination of two things. To my previous point, one thing I forgot to mention was I did mention the price of the multimode readers, right? So those two things sort of go hand in hand, where you have decentralization on the one hand, but of course the devices have to be affordable enough in order for you to have that value proposition, right? So if you say every lab should have their own microplate reader, it should also be at a price point that enables that process to happen, right? So we are less expensive than traditional readers. The fact that we're 1/10 of the size of traditional microplate readers allows us to save on materials, save on shipping, save on a lot of different things. So like I said, I think that's an important point to mention with decentralization. And then the last point is really very essential to the concept of our company as well, and is an essential part of Re-Envision Laboratory, and that is usability. So I think a big part of our concept and our vision lies in creating the perfect user experience, or at least trying to create the perfect user experience. And I think that's also something that maybe got a little bit neglected in the past with these larger instruments. The more features you pack into one instrument, yeah, it's almost impossible to maintain the user friendliness, right? And you wouldn't think that there seems to be an unwritten rule that any new software solution in life science has to look like Windows 97. I don't know. I haven't seen the norm. I don't know if that's actually I haven't seen any of the regulations, but I don't know if that's an actual rule. But I think for us too, a big part of it is just to question those things, right? Why is it that way? Why are these readers so big? Why does it have to have this big plastic housing? Why can't we take some lessons from things that have established themselves in B2C markets or have been established in B2C, yeah, markets for a long time, right? The idea of applying things like industrial design, simplification, right? Elegance and simplicity, right? These are, like I said, these are lessons that people in B2C have learned a long time ago. So for us too, that's a big part of what we're doing and what we're trying to do with Re-Envision Laboratory as well. You see, we have such high-tech products everywhere in our lives, right? And yeah, then you go into a laboratory, and in some cases, there is a device that will print out like a small receipt, right? That comes out of the top of the instrument, and then people will copy the values printed out on this piece of paper into their laboratory notebook, and it's just there's so much room there to innovate, and I think that's the last aspect of what I would say is really Re-Envision Laboratory, is to sort of enter into that space and do what we can to sort of breathe new life into that space from a, like I said, from a product design standpoint, from a software standpoint, usability standpoint as well.
No, for sure. I mean, I think sometimes we're more innovative in our personal lives than we are sometimes in the lab. Also. But so if I were just to summarize it just by bullet points, I wrote down some notes here as you were chatting. I think so. I mean, your instruments, when you talk about re-envisioning the lab, it's about making it more inclusive. So you're not just, the bigger the unit, the more complex the unit, typically the bigger the price tag. And as a result, you subsequently, whether you want to or not, you are eliminating a good chunk of labs that would benefit from it but can't afford it because they don't have the budget for it on that front. So I think you guys are challenging on that front to make it way more inclusive. You talked about flexibility, decentralizing the lab, and so forth. Easy to use as well, so anybody could use it. I mean, I'm amazed sometimes. We have our iPhones. Basically, you just follow the simple instruction, and you're set up, and you're done, and you're ready to go. And yet, sometimes with lab automation, you've got to do all this training. You've got to get a specialist in. You've got to know how to be a programmer. And if you don't have a programmer in your operation, then maybe you can't benefit from that, or you need to hire somebody, or you need to outsource it. And it just creates a lot of complexity. And the reality is that lab automation should be simple and reduce complexity. So there's a bit of a dichotomy sometimes, I feel, in that respect. So
yeah, I think that's really true. And I think we have a lot of examples of that we see amongst our own customers as well, and see sort of the things that they struggle with, and in terms of usability as well, right? It's not just about the onboarding process or getting started with the instrument, right? I mean, I've seen instruments where the first 15 pages are just dedicated to unboxing the instrument and removing all of the screws, transportation safety mechanisms, right? Yeah. But it even goes beyond that of what happens when the one person in the lab who's dealt with this instrument for the last 20 years leaves,
yes.
Right? All of a sudden, you can find graveyards of instruments in academic institutions, right? They're just full of equipment that nobody knows nobody knows how to use anymore, that isn't being actively serviced. In one extreme case, actually, I was discussing with a laboratory whose lab tech had actually passed away. So he was an older gentleman, and he passed away, and nobody knew how to use any of the instruments once he was gone, right? So wow. It's sort of, again, that's an extreme example, but I think that also speaks to the importance of usability. It's like, okay, this should not only be easy to get started with, it should be easy to continue using. So yeah, it's a good point.
Oh, it's very true. And then myself, sometimes when I go into the labs and I see this equipment just sitting somewhere in a corner and literally just gathering dust, and then you ask somebody, okay, so what does that do? You don't know. I don't know what it does. Just looking at it, and they're like, I don't know. It was there when I got here. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
On that front. So I think this is probably a good segue then into SLAS 2023. So you guys won the new product award for your Absorbance 96 Automate. So first of all, I guess congratulations.
Thank you very much.
It's not I mean, it's quite a tough achievement, I would think, to win, because you're up against very innovative, very creative companies. So it's a credit to you and to your team that you won it. I guess maybe you just want to walk us through and talk us through what the instrument does, all the bells and whistles, so to speak, and then maybe more importantly, how it fits into your re-envisioning sort of the lab idea, in terms of, why it's a necessary or useful tool, at least, to have in the laboratory.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, it was a huge pleasure and privilege to win the new product award at SLAS. I mean, we were ourselves surprised at how positive the reaction was to the device at SLAS, and there was so much buzz, and there were people taking selfies at our booth with the instrument, and it was a pretty crazy experience, to be honest. So I was there with Yusuf, our CEO, and it was yeah, like I said, a very, very special experience. So thanks again to SLAS. But yeah, I guess Absorbance 96 Automate it's also a special product, and it definitely does fit, or it is in keeping with our vision of, or with our slogan of Re-Envision Laboratory. As you know, I think what it's important to mention at this point too is we really do have a talented team of engineers in development and in product development. And you know, one thing that I was discussing with them a while back was we were talking about this idea of mechanics. You know, and there are most microplate readers work with like some type of scanning mechanism, or they have a tray, right? So a tray that would open, and sometimes it opens into the liquid handler so that it can still be loaded in the Z-axis.
Yeah.
And but our approach was to say, okay, we're putting something on deck of one of the most complicated mechanical machines in the world, right? Like this machine is it's just one big piece of mechanics. So there's so many moving parts, so many motors, you know, the grippers, everything about this just screams, you know, complicated mechanics. So why would we build in even more mechanics into this process, right? Why not just use the existing infrastructure that's there to service our instrument? And I thought that was just such an elegant approach. Again, this was just a discussion I was having with the developers. I thought and I think that's really something that makes us special, is really our development team and the talented people we have there. And yeah, that's really what Absorbance 96 Automate is. It's a product, again, that can be serviced by an existing gripper on a liquid handler, for example, or any type of microplate gripper. And that is, again, what you were speaking to earlier as well with usability, right? A big part of the concept of this device is the idea of easy integration. Right? We don't want you have to pay a service tech to come by and, like, you know, install the device for you and you know, charge you whatever that costs. This should be something that you can just set on deck, right? You can either write your own labware description, or there's already a labware description available for your system. Ideally, you know, we're using the latest standards, like we're SILA or SILA 2 compatible as well, and trying to really use industry standards so that our device can just be easily adopted for existing users, and then also easily implemented for everyone else as well who wants to get started using the instrument. So, like I said, I think that's an important part of it. And in terms of, you know, Re-Envision Laboratory, we've really noticed that the one trend on the one hand is decentralization, which I already touched on, but the other trend, of course, it's undeniable, right? The other trend is automation. And we see ourselves as being uniquely positioned to sort of service both of those trends and push them forward. It's like I said, that's a big part of it as well, as just saying we have the right tools, and we have identified these two trends, and this one is moving more towards automation. And like I said, that's sort of the approach that we took there with the device, was to just simplify the device itself and incorporate it with existing infrastructure.
Very cool. And if we think about, I guess, technology overall, maybe in particular, I guess, lab automation, I always ask this question, from your perspective, does it help drive innovation in the lab? And if so, how? And if you believe no, which I don't think you will, why not?
Yeah, it's always good to push the guests in a certain direction. But how are you convinced that this promotes creativity? Yeah, no, I would actually agree with that, because I think there are sort of, I don't know, maybe three ways that I think that it really does promote creativity, or it can promote creativity. I guess two of them are sort of related, but I think the first way is really just providing a new framework, right? Providing a new frame of reference. Because this is something, you know, for example, people criticize chess a lot because they're like, oh, you know, there's a restricted number of moves and it doesn't leave you any room for creativity, right? But try playing a game with no rules or no board or no setup, right? It's harder to ask questions. It's harder to actually be creative in the absence of any type of structure. So I think that's something that laboratory automation has the capacity to do as well, right? It has the capacity to say, okay, this is the new framework, right? So we're working in automation. Maybe we can ask different questions now. Maybe, right? Maybe we can say, okay, maybe our question isn't how does this protein interact with this other protein? Maybe it's how does this protein interact with 1,536 other proteins, right? Maybe I have a high throughput screen. So I think that's one big way in which it can really drive creativity, because it just forces you to put yourself in a new situation. And like I said, inside of a new framework that maybe you're not as familiar with. So I think that's definitely one way. And of course, what I started with at the introduction as well of this podcast was just talking about time, right? Talking about time, talking about automating tasks to deal with all of these different things going on, and really trying to be efficient. And I think that this applies very well to the laboratory automation setting as well. You know, if you're spending all your time pipetting and running gels and you know, doing all of these tasks that really could be automated, there's hardly any room left over for you to really do what you need to do in a lot of cases, and that is just think, right? It's just think about things on a theoretical level, you know, parse the literature, do a lot of other things that are really important with research, right? What you're actually doing in the lab is just sort of it's a means to an end, right? And I think that that's something that we also focus on at Byonoy, is saying, you know, you should focus on your research, not on the tools you're using to do the research, right? So everything should sort of fade into the background, and you have a question and you get an answer, and whatever steps are in between there, right? The more efficient those steps are, the easier it is, the more enjoyable that process is, the better, right? Because there's no sort of, you know, of course there are things to be gained from suffering, but I don't really think so in terms of pipetting. So I think that's the second way that it really does promote creativity, by freeing up your time, freeing up space to really think about other things and focus on other aspects of lab work or research. And I think the last point ties into that as well, of course. And this is something I've listened to a few other episodes of your podcast, and you know, it's something a lot of other guests have mentioned as well. But this idea of strain, yeah. I think it is something that is, you know, a friend of mine, actually, a very brilliant friend of mine, if I may say so. He's working at MIT, and he actually injured his wrists from pipetting too much. Very dedicated, very dedicated guy, and he was out for weeks because of the injuries he got on his wrists from pipetting. And then now still he has to wear like a brace whenever he's pipetting in the lab. And of course, right, there are, first of all, other things he should be putting his time into versus pipetting. And, you know, that downtime, who knows what that costs in terms of, you know, like I said, providing that answer to the original question he asked. So I think those sort of three things are really what have the potential, three things that have the potential to really drive creativity and with laboratory automation as well. So, yeah. Awesome.
Well, Colten, I just want to say thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure. I wish you and Byonoy the best of luck, and you continue to grow. And I think we'll probably see you at SLAS in Boston, maybe in February next year. Yeah.
Yes, you probably will, and who knows? Maybe there will be a few more additions to the Byonoy portfolio by then. So yeah, stay tuned.
Super. Thanks, Colten.
All right, thanks a lot, Alex. Take care.